This is the very last section of your EOC study guide. Now, if you watched the last video, it ended with, the video ended kind of abruptly and pretty shortly. I do want to direct you to your notes where you can find the answers to animal behavior. That's on page 116. Remember that some of these are innate behaviors and some of these are learned behaviors. So I would like for you, please, to put a little circle here and write L for learned. This one is an example of both. And then these two are examples of innate behaviors. Now do keep in mind that there are many more behaviors in our notes than just these. However, these are the ones that tend to show up most often on the EOC. So again, I always encourage you when you start working on the study guide to actually start by rereading your notes. The last part of the study guide is the material that we learned most recently, and that is on ecology. And so, again, you'll want to start by reviewing your notes. Ecology notes for us started on page 123. So you will want to write that down, page 123. And you'll want to start before you might want to pause the video, go back to your notes and read through it so that hopefully you can remember these and not just be copying it from your notes. It first asks you to list biotic and abiotic factors. Now what I'm going to do is help you remember the definition. Your job is actually to answer the question. Remember, bio means life. And so we're talking about living things which are made of cells. And so your job now is to list 3 biotic factors, 3 living things. Try to think about your different types of kingdoms. Remember we have 6 kingdoms, so try to think about that. The prefix A means not. So you're looking for not living things. Now remember, 1 plus 2 is actually going to be your ecosystems. That's why this title is about ecosystems. In ecosystems, we study living and non-living things. If I were studying a community, I'd just be studying the biotic factors. Number 3, this is going to be pretty easy to do. They say to use spaces, but we used math symbols. So remember we used plus, minus, and 0. What I want to remind you is that all of these relationships start with a plus. In all of these relationships, somebody is benefiting. But the second organism might be another plus, might be a 0, might be a minus. Look in the words for the one that has an O, and that's the one that's plus 0. And so you do want to use words and symbols. So if we're saying that both of them benefit, we would show plus plus, and we would write both benefit. The next is actual examples of this, and what I want to encourage you to do as you do this is use your symbols. So the clever honey finder birds lead humans to beehives, so that human hands will open the dangerous beehive and expose the precious honeycomb for the bird to access. The human gets a plus because it's getting honey. The bird gets a plus because it's getting honey, so it's plus plus. And so remember that is mutualism. And so you do have a few more examples to go through here. And once you've defined it, then you'll know how to find those answers. The next part is on population ecology, and so it is asking you to draw an S-curve and draw a J-curve. So remember an S-curve starts with a J and then levels off because we reach carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the largest number that we can support, and remember it does kind of dip up and down right around that carrying capacity. A J-curve is what's called exponential or logistic. Those two words mean the same thing. So an S-curve is not exponential. It doesn't keep growing and growing. But a J-curve is exponential. That's also called logistic. J-curve does not reach carrying capacity. Remember, limiting factors are things that limit the population. So this population is unlimited. So there are no limiting factors. This population reached its limit, so yes, there are. And this is the one that describes human. Human growth has just continued on and on. Next, it wants you to write the hierarchy from smallest to largest, and so we're going to go kind of backwards. They didn't really give you all of the lines that we talked about, so biosphere and biome will go here, and then we have ecosystem, and then we have community, and then we have population. And so organism and population kind of go together there. Then it wants you to make a prediction about whether the population will increase, decrease, or remain stable. And you have some of these charts. Now remember, these charts look just like the pictures we saw before. If there's a high birth rate, but there's also a high infant mortality, keep in mind that infant mortality means that the babies die young. Excuse me. They die. And so we're having a lot of babies, but a lot of those babies are also dying. That means that the population is going to be pretty stable. But if we have a high birth rate and a low death rate, that means that the population is going to increase. You should be able to look at these other two and figure them out. Emigration, remember, means that you are leaving. So if you are emigrating, that means that you are leaving. These population pyramids will for sure be on your EOC. What we want to do is kind of trace it. So this one that's how we would trace it. If we trace this one, it looks like it's pointing up. And if we trace this one, it actually has kind of a bubble here, but it's basically pointing down. And so we should be able to know if the population is increasing, decreasing, or stable by looking at what we traced. Because this one looks like an arrow pointing up, this one is going to be increasing. Okay, so then we look at energy transfer and our biogeochemical cycles. And so again, all of this was in your notes, and it's really helpful if you go back and use your notes or read your notes. You will for sure see a food web on your EOC, and they will ask you to make some predictions based on what you see. This is a really important question, so make sure that you put a star by it. What are the producers in this food web? The producers are always found at the bottom of the food web. So you should be able to list for me the producers. The primary consumers are the ones that eat those. So we should be able to find some primary consumers. I'm going to ask you to list 3, and I'm going to give you 1. So eating the plants are insects, and so that is one of the examples of a herbivore. Secondary consumers are the ones that eat other animals, and they eat second. So first arrow, primary consumer, second arrow is a secondary consumer. So again, list 3 of them, and the toad is one example. Blossoms, bees, the bear. So the bear would be an example of a secondary consumer. But the bear is also an example of a tertiary, 1, 2, 3 arrows. The bear is also an example of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th level consumer as well. And so this bear is going to be eating on many levels. What would happen if the insects were removed? So if we removed the insects, we would have more of something. The insects eat bark and leaves and blossoms, and so we would have more bark and leaves. But we would also have less of the toad, because the toad eats the insects. And so the toad population would decrease because the toad only eats insects. And so if there are no insects to eat, the toad population would probably starve. You will see a food web on your EOC, and they will ask you questions like, what if we removed all of the skunks? An energy pyramid from this food chain. And so when we look at the food chain, we should be able to find our producers. Remember, producers always go on the bottom. So the oak bark goes here, and then we would go up, rabbit, wolf, and bear. Keep in mind that at the top of the pyramid, that means we can have fewer of those, because the most energy, what happens to energy as it moves through the food web, it gets lost. And what percent? 90% gets lost, 10% gets transferred. And so the least amount of energy is going to be up here. The least amount of energy is going to be at our bear, and the most amount of energy is, again, at the bottom. The highest biomass, again, the pyramid is really helpful. So the highest biomass, meaning how many organisms can we support, that is going to be the oak trees. The ultimate source of energy for all life on Earth, Remember, the very first transfer of energy is actually photosynthesis. When this oak tree takes energy and turns it into carbohydrates, that's our first energy source. And so the ultimate source of energy is going to be the sun. And the EOC loves to ask that question to see if you know that without the sun, no photosynthesis, nothing to eat. The role of bacteria and fungi, what are they called and what is their job? They are, starts with a D, decomposers. And you should be able to find me their job. What do decomposers do? What is nitrification and what is its purpose? Now, we talked about nitrogen fixation. So nitrification is the same thing as nitrogen fixation. And this is going to be needed for growth. But too much can actually kill an environment. So we talked about how if there's too much nitrogen, like from fertilizers, then some plants will overgrow and some plants will undergrow. So too much equals what we call overgrowth. Too much nitrogen, like from fertilizers, means that we have overgrowth and some organisms can outcompete the others, and that's really harmful. 2 ways that carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere. This you need to go back to your notes for. Actually, you probably shouldn't. You should be able to tell me how carbon dioxide gets into the atmosphere. We studied the cycle of carbon. One reaction releases carbon into the atmosphere because carbon dioxide is the waste. So what process do you know that produces carbon dioxide? You should know that one. And then the other has to do with combustion or burning, and that's all in your notes. Water can enter the atmosphere by evaporating from leaves of plants in what process? I'll give you a hint. It starts with a T, but it is directly in your notes. So on purpose, I'm not giving you the answers because I'm wanting you to go back and read your notes. In what ways does deforestation disrupt the carbon cycle? Think about the importance of plants to the carbon cycle. The EOC, again, loves to ask that question about deforestation. Almost done. Now we're just looking at human impact. So if we have a really large population size, what is the effect on the environment? We have increased pollution. We have increased habitat destruction. Next to my house right now, they're building a new neighborhood, cutting down bunches of trees. Where will those birds live? Where will those squirrels live? Their habitat's being destroyed. Acid rain. Remember, this is going to harm our aquatic ecosystems. Aquatic ecosystems the most. It does also cause crop damage. Introduce non-native species. Now, we may not have talked about this very much, but if it's a non-native or invasive species, it out-competes others, and this can harm that circle of life, right? Think back to the Lion King video, the circle of life. If we introduce a new species and they can outcompete the others, it is going to harm our food web, and it usually kills other species. Pesticide use, bioaccumulation, and biomagnification. We want to talk about bioaccumulation is when the pesticide gets on all the organisms. But bioaccumulation increases as you go up the food chain. So those top predators, like the eagle that's flying around, it gets some of the pesticide because of bioaccumulation, but it also gets a lot of the pesticide through the things that it eats. Deforestation, please tell me the effect on the carbon cycle. I'm going to put carbon cycle question mark, but you should be able to tell me the effect. And ozone depletion, remember this means that we have a lower amount, that's what depletion means, of ozone. And so what this means is we have higher UV rays, which leads to cancer, blindness because of cataracts. Okay, I think we just have a little bit more left, and this is going to be looking at the carbon cycle. Remember, we want to go back and actually read through the notes for this, so I'm going to skip this section. but it's right there in your notes. So the last are just some resources for you. Please remember to